Great. It's like when you
That's good.
Okay. We'll go ahead and get started in 1 second. When Phil wants to feel bad. The yellow, I'm just obsessed with it. Okay. So thank y'all so much for having me. I'm very excited to spend Wednesday night with y'all. I know y'all had big plans tonight, aka class as usual. So I appreciate it. Except for Fo, who's the true MVP and came of her own volition. The agenda for today is that I'm gonna do a quick introduction of myself and some resources. And then we're gonna talk about the theoretical underpinnings. So we're gonna talk about the readings that I assigned, and we're gonna talk about what disability justice and CRIP is. So we kind of have like a common language to discuss what the goal of a disability justice pedagogy looks like. And then we're going to break up into small groups, and I have like an activity on how to make teaching aspects accessible. It is very much a skill that you learn, and you learn by doing. So it'll be kind of a good guided way to figure out like how to relook at teaching aspects to make them as accessible as possible. And then we'll kind of come back to big group and talk more about reflections on that, and then have specific questions. With disability, there are a lot of individual specific cases because every disability is unique, even within commonalities of diagnosis or lived experiences. And so I want to make room for you to ask questions for that. But before we do, can we go around and you just say your names so I make sure I'm pronouncing them correctly for the night? That would be great. I would have never got that. I'm so glad you told me. I'm sorry, what?
Morgan.
Don't
Shelly.
Fo.
Fo.
Audrey.
Thank you.
Nadia.
Aubrey.
Shamedia.
Veronica.
Christine.
Oh, I'll have like names I can say. What a joy. Okay. So to introduce myself, so yes, I'm Pedagogy. I'm a third-year doctoral student in this program with an intended, which I'm sure will change, dissertation on disability justice pedagogy. So as of now, no one has operationalized what that is. And so that is kind of what I'm undertaking in my own research. And I'll come sit down in a second. I just want to show you one quick thing. Not only have I been doing disability studies for 5 years now. It was my concentration in my master's at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I am also disabled. And so I have been an undergrad and a graduate student with accommodations through DSS and navigating higher education. And then I also worked at DSS here at TW as the assistive technology specialist. So I really like talking about myself and found the best way to do that. So, so that is just a little bit about me. Before we get started, I just wanted to point y'all out to research, and I can send this to you, Audrey, so you can share. So this is actually what Fo and I's pedagogy class made. We had to create our own workshops on certain topics, and then we put them all in a website. And so you have like really great things for teaching through current events, navigating privilege. We have a whole big technology section. If you're an online teacher, there's some really innovative technology stuff. But because it's all about me, I want to look at really quick the section that I did with my group. So one of the core tenets of disability justice is centering interdependence. So common views about disability, or to be a good disabled person in the everyday world, is kind of seen as you can do anything by yourself, like you don't need help anymore. And so disability justice wants to push back against that. Disability justice says that no one does anything alone. Why are we trying to like set people up to fail? And so I just wanted to show you this quick community page. This is what we did in our workshop. We have all the theoretical underpinnings. My part was actually practical application. So these are all the things that I do in my class and I've made available to the public. And then we have a collaborative writing activity that was super fun. And then we have readings to further. So I just wanted to say that I'm not going to be talking about community in the classroom, although clearly I love it, but it is one step to making your classroom as accessible as possible, is to build this classroom and community so people feel like they can ask for the things that they need. Questions? Okay.
You said you'll share that link.
I totally will, yes. It's called Is It in the Syllabus? We had some fun. Okay. So feel free to move around the space as you need, stretch, get up, go to the bathroom, do whatever, make this as accessible for yourselves as possible. And as I said that I am disabled, but I want to be very clear and make sure that talking about tonight, I don't do the thing that sometimes happens where you assume you're the only disabled person in the room. A lot of the readings that talk about universal design often are like, here's what able-bodied teachers can do. And it's like, no. So I just want to be like really clear that I recognize that some of you in here may be disabled educators as well. And so some things that might be accessible for me might not be for you. And that's totally fine. And we can talk about that if you want, or you can come and talk to me afterwards. And then, yeah, okay. Let's talk about the readings. I love these readings. Let's start with Mad at School. So this was Margaret Price's book in 2010, chapter 2. I really encourage you if you want like a really good, stable understanding of mental disability to read chapter 1. It gives really good definitions and understandings. If you're watching online or you didn't know about the readings, they're totally fine. Hopefully these questions, you'll still be able to kind of get what's going on and get the main points out of it. So what did you like about Mad at School? Yeah.
I mean, I'm gonna come out a little bit this way, but like I felt very seen and validated by it. I felt like a lot of my experiences, both here and in my master's program, were like not. There's this sort of gaslighting effect that goes on in a lot of disability, where if it's not seen, people assume it's not there, and so you start questioning it yourself. And so this piece in particular resonated with me personally because I felt very seen.
Awesome. Yes. Yeah.
It sparked I really liked the calling on or calling around activity, and I thought that was one because due to some of my own like past childhood trauma, I didn't talk in a classroom until like I was probably about 16, and now I don't. But the idea of like, yeah, that some folks just like aren't ready to speak, and that kind of calling around can like open up that space. I liked that idea. The reading itself kind of gave me like a question. I was really thinking like, what does education for all really mean? Because it seems like a lot of schools or a lot of colleges are failing at that.
Yeah, and like in some ways, the perfect accessible utopia is a myth, right? There will never be one space that is accessible for everyone. Something that is really accessible for me may be inaccessible. In fact, a concrete example of that I had to work with in disability services is that we had one student who had a service dog in the classroom and another student who was definitely allergic to dogs. So just because of the huge, massive community that makes up disability, there will never be one space that can handle it all. That being said, you can do like 95% of that work to make it as close as possible. And yeah, I think a lot of higher education and even K through 12 are failing.
I worked at this private college for 5 years, and I also went there for my undergrad, and their disabilities studies office was not accessible. There was no wheelchair, no nothing. It was a bunch of stairs. I was like, how does that work?
Yeah, we're the tornado shelter here at TW. We literally have no windows, and our hallways are so small that it's difficult to get a wheelchair in and out. And like, I often call us, like when I was working there, I would be like, we're the Harry Potter, like we're just tucked under the stairs at CFO that everyone kind of forgets about. And so yeah, it's a big issue, like the physicality of campus. But yeah, I appreciated that Price gives like very tangible tips and tricks to like, and shows almost how easy it can be once you have the tools and the resources. What else? Yeah.
I had not heard the term chirotic space. Am I pronouncing that right?
You are,
And
like a pro.
On page 61, she lists the qualities of chirotic space, and what stood out to me was that it's high stakes, that it's a place where power is exchanged, and I really appreciate that it's setting up, it's communicating that the classroom and environment and exchange of power is its own thing. It's, a lot of times you hear like, you go to school, you'll learn how to get along in the real world, but a lot of studies are showing that that's not true. Like psychological studies show that what we learn in the classroom doesn't necessarily transfer to other environments. And so I really, really love that term. And I've already used it in an article. So thank you for doing that.
You're welcome. I definitely just turned in a paper that used it too. And I'm like, how fortunate. This is the same week. Yeah, I think it gives like a name that you can actually point to it. Because like there was an event on campus I had to go to earlier today, and I'm someone who has severe social anxiety. You cannot tell that by looking at me because I fake it till I make it. But it was really great to have this term to be like, this is a chronic space for me, right? Like it is high risk. I don't want to look dumb. There are people there who could influence what workshops I can do on campus, my future, right? But for many other people, they were just like, it's not even like, it's just an easy event that you go to and you listen and learn. And so there's like kind of understanding the power dynamics inherent in every interaction, particularly ones with high risk, is really important. So yeah, I love that term so much. I'm glad that you were able to use it. Anything else? So the question I just asked, what do you like about this piece, is often a very good way to start a conversation and have people who have anxiety or on the autism spectrum be able to talk about it in as low risk as possible. So it's still a product space, right? It's still scary to come out and say something like that. But it breaks it down where there's no right or wrong answer. And it is open-ended enough where students who maybe have trouble with social cues, or not trouble, but like fitting in the normative ways of like, what to do, can engage with the readings that more direct questions may not be able to. So I utilize this a lot in my intro class. I usually always start with, what do you like, what do you don't like? I try to start with, what do you like, because reading a little bit more generously before we begin our fun critiques, as Women's Studies does. But it really does, for those people who don't like to talk, who participate in another way, or for those who have anxiety or on the spectrum, it's a really great way to have as low a risk as possible for talking about the readings, right? They're allowed to engage in whatever way they want, have whatever opinions they want, rather than a more structured question. Does that make sense? Okay. Cool. So thank you for Aubrey for defining product space. That was my next question. And y'all have these questions. Did I put these questions on yours? Sorry, mine looks slightly different. I think so. One of your handouts. There were many. It's fun. So I think I want to go with kind of following up. We kind of answered the first two with Matt at school, but how do we alleviate the risks within chronic spaces when working with students with disabilities, and all students, right? So Price gives us some concrete examples. I just talked about one, but I want to brainstorm a few others, because I think, I want you to leave here having like a whole list of things you can actively employ every time you teach.
I think, for example, on page 90 through 91, where he talks about talking about accommodations in the class as opposed to pointing to it on the syllabus. Because you said like just that conversation at the beginning of the course may generate questions or reflections. I thought that was important.
Yeah, exactly. Like calling to attention about the fact that like we are diverse learners and some of us have different needs. I think many of us when we teach, I mean, I did this until just recently, just put the syllabus disability statement at the very end, and like we're just like, there's a statement, read it over. And so now I have tried to like particularly talk about it in that first day, and the amount of people since I've started doing that who will come up with me that first class period is significant. And so, I totally stole that from Price. That's the great thing about teaching the field of education, is that everything is like, please take this and do it. Wonderful. What else?
I don't know if this fits within alleviate the risk, for additional opportunities for work that recognizes the different ways of learning. So I know she talked about from impromptu to more formalized essays, in addition to conversations to allow space for those that may not feel as comfortable speaking in class, as well as interactions, one-on-one, either via office or text or FaceTime or whatever, she was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. G-chatting with students is like such a great way to kind of, you still feel kind of at a high risk, but I found that it works a lot better for students who feel very uncomfortable coming in and having a one-on-one with me in the GWS office. And so, hey Carla, how's it going? No, you're fine. And so we see how allowing for that adaptation or giving multiple options to begin with, it invites people to use them more. And so in the little brochure that is folded in a way that hopefully you will figure out at some point, I give tips on what participation can look like. For my class, participation doesn't look like one thing. I never require people to speak aloud. I accept no cards. I accept emails after. Sometimes I get little torn off questions at the end of class. And sometimes all I get is active listening. One of the things that I do in my classroom is I go, do we get that? Head nods, head shakes. And of course that might not be accessible for everyone, but for the most part, it gives me a good view of who is engaged and who isn't. And then often I make a joke that like, whoa, we're not at a rock concert here, but take it easy. It works well. I get good pity laughs with it. Morgan can attest. Morgan is usually the one in the corner giving me pity laughs. And so you can, because active listening is hard to tell, right? And so that is one way in which if you have students who consistently don't talk, you can kind of gauge where they are in the classroom. What are some other things?
One thing that she mentioned were explicit descriptions of, or wait, I might be getting them confused, but somebody talked about explicit descriptions of the expected classroom of the culture of the classroom. And now that I think about it, I think that was the other reading.
Okay, we're about to move there, so you're just ahead of the game. Okay. Yes. Also, one of the best ways I have found to kind of alleviate this chirotic space is by pointing it out, right? When students come in and I can tell they're very anxious and uncomfortable, I will say okay, let's stop. This isn't fun. And we will take a deep breath and we'll talk about a TV show or something, right? Recognizing that I know you're uncomfortable, I'm uncomfortable too, even though it doesn't seem that way, cracking with a joke is a great way to kind of understand that this space is high risk for that person. Because I think part of that struggle is the expectation to be on, especially when you're working with students and trying to write paper and you're okay, so how can you connect these two together? And they're right on the spot, well, and it's you don't have to do it now. I just want you to think about it. And so I think calling attention whenever you can in individual meetings, in the classroom when you're asking hard questions is actually a great way to recognize those power dynamics and then help mitigate them. Cool. Do we want to talk teaching with trauma? Which is Angela Carter said, right? Okay. So Carter discusses how trauma within the classroom must be addressed and accommodated from a community and societal perspective rather than an individual perspective. What solutions does Carter offer in terms of pedagogical moves to enact this in feminist classrooms? So essentially, what is, like Price, what tips, what tricks does she give us? Yeah.
It's interesting because Melissa, when you were I usually start with these, what do you like?
I know.
What do you don't like? And I was that's odd. But then when you didn't, I missed it. I was oh damn, that's
I know.
a real page
Everyone,
9 question.
I know.
You know what I mean? I felt very much like it was an exam or a pop quiz, and I was not ready
I know.
But I don't know if you meant to
I
demonstrate that.
did actually, so thanks.
Okay then, no worries.
Also, if I didn't, I'm just gonna take that as like, yeah, I totally meant that. Yeah, I think it's like all of a sudden you hear like the frantic page turning, like oh shit, oh shit, oh shit.
Yeah, there was a lot of them shit in her channel.
Yeah.
For sure.
So we could start if we want. Let's take a break. Everyone taking a deep breath.
Go back to that cool stuff we were saying.
Yeah. What do you like about this piece?
Okay. I can answer that.
Yeah, me.
Okay, so, I don't know, I think that, I haven't read a lot of stuff about teaching with trauma, I guess. And so even though I have trauma and I teach with trauma and my students have trauma and all the trauma, and so I guess that for me, that was just interesting to see, people, I mean, I just haven't read a lot of stuff about it. I mean, I have opinions about it and I've done some research on how to, you know, for instance, dealing with sexual assault in the classroom, talking about sexual assault and knowing you're not, that there's more than one person in there that's been affected. But as far as it just being broken down like this, as far as like, these are the misunderstandings and this is what we need to look at with the misunderstandings, and I just thought it was really clear.
Yeah, yeah, like very much what Christine said earlier about not at school, like you feel seen when it's like actually breaking down what the fuck is trauma and how you deal with it in the classroom. Especially important in a feminist classroom, right? Where like literally every week we are dealing with some sort of trauma that's been inflicted from systemic oppression. Yeah, what else did you like?
Yeah, I appreciated her like naming her approach to trauma, like specifically from an affective, like Caruth framework, and then also the way in which she identified a relationship between trauma and disability, but didn't conflate them.
Yeah.
And as someone with both and like kind of a foot in both worlds, like that made a lot of sense to
Yeah.
me. That there is a relationship there, but they're not the same thing.
And for some people they are, and some people they aren't too, right? So Carter allows for that ambiguity, right? So that's a word I can say sometimes. So if we think about the legal aspects, right? PTSD is covered under the legal aspects of ABA, but many people who experience trauma don't actually claim a positive disabled identity, partly because claiming positive disabled identity often is a very white construct, and part of it is because people don't know what trauma is. I think leading psychologists have talked about how trauma is one of the lowest diagnosed, like way everyone has trauma and it is not diagnosed as such in the psychology field. And so, yeah, it is great that it approaches it from a disability perspective without being like, and everyone should go to DSS and get accommodations, right? It is kind of moving past ADA, because the Americans with Disability Act, which gives civil rights to people with disabilities, which wasn't given until 1990 and then ratified in 2008, is the floor, not the ceiling, right? It is the base level. And so what we're doing today is really trying to get as close to the ceiling as possible. One more, what did you like? And then we'll move on to the hard questions.
I just really, really connected with this article as somebody who had, so I don't know if anybody has seen season 3 of Queer Eye.
Yes.
Episode 7, Sloth to Slay.
Oh, yeah.
And Jonathan Van Ness says, he refers to the main character, the person, I forget his name, but his trauma as big T trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I connected with this article. And so like I've just recently realized that I have big T trauma and how this comes out in like life and daily life. And this was just amazing. Like everything, I was just like, yes, it's so accurate. And yeah, and how she connected trauma, mental disability. I work with faculty here at TW, and I thought that could be like every single faculty member needs to read this.
Yeah. Low key, maybe send it to one of my professors who had a horribly inaccessible assignment. So we'll see how that goes. It was at UNC, not here. So we'll see. I actually did that today. So I put on my bravery prints, popped a Xanax, I got that done. But yeah, I agree, right? Because we all experience little T and big T trauma at some point. And so to recognize that that is something we're actively negotiating in like tangible ways, especially in the midst of this debate where it's like, we're just coddling them. It's like, no, you're being a decent human being, and I don't know why that's a question. And I thought Carter does a really good job of laying out why that shouldn't be a question. Okay, so what things does Carter say we can do?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Before we move to the hard questions.
For sure.
So a while ago when you said like for people that don't have a positive disability identity, can you flesh that out a little bit for some of us who have never sat and talked about like that kind of, because you said, because I do not identify as disabled at all, but like, well, sure, I have PTSD and I have OCD and I have asthma and I have some shit going on.
So like legally, you are under the
See,
disabled.
but that shit, but when you said that, I was just like, well, what does that even?
Yeah. So complicated. And I'm happy to give you more.
Yeah, I don't mean to take away from it.
No, no,
Just
no.
when you said that, it was just
So
like,
right,
I've never heard anybody say that.
Right, partly because of very much like the feminist movement, how it is, the mainstream movement has very much been dominated by whiteness. A similar thing has happened with disability rights, right? So the people you're seeing identifying as disabled have been white people with access to disabled networks, like federally, right? I show a clip in when I teach about Capitol Crawl, which was right before they passed ADA in 1990, where like 600, maybe more disabled people climbed up all of the steps of the Capitol building because they could not get in and they weren't passing civil rights for disabled people. And like almost all of the people in that are white. So part of it is that. Part of it is because in resisting, very legitimately resisting pathologization, we've kind of other disability, right? So Leonard Davis, who I have like low-key beef with, but like his writing's good, it's fine. He talks about how disability is often the other, right? So when when communities of color are rightfully pushing back against talking about like deformed skulls or particular parts of their muscles, right? They're pushing back against disabled embodiments, right? Similarly, we have queer communities, right? Which again, rightfully was pushing back against pathologization with homosexuality in the DSM. Asexuality is still in the DSM today. And so in pushing back against that, what often they do is they put disability down. And so it becomes a distancing thing where to claim a disabled identity is often really problematic, really difficult to do, especially in a positive way when many people are disabled through trauma, right? Through violence and through war, through systemic oppression. So all of those things are kind of playing together, like working together to make it really hard for people with disabilities to actually claim having a disability. Any questions on that? That was my quick 5-minute. Let me know if you want more resources and I'd be happy to give it to you. Okay, can we finish this question so we can do the fun activity and I stop talking at you? Okay, so what does Carter say? What does Carter offer to enact, right, this addressing trauma and trigger warnings in the classroom? Yeah.
Building the space on 13. The idea in the second paragraph, the idea of students anonymously submitting any potential triggering topics that they may have. And I know I'm going back to the first question, but I was I liked the whole, like throughout this whole article, and I mean I looked a couple times, but the ethical non-naming of University of Chicago, which notoriously published the trigger warnings. You know, we're not gonna adhere to trigger warnings. I thought was a really, really great political move, reminding me of like how she also said on page 4 this idea of like I'm making a political move to include other folks who aren't going to get a diagnosis. She also made a political move not mentioning University of Chicago, and I organized grad students there for a year, and it really needs more disability access.
Yeah. So yeah, that's one tangible thing, making room for it, allowing students to talk about it. So along with what Shamithia brought up earlier, right, just talking about disability up front by making space for people to be able to take that and ask for it, right, to feel like, because I guarantee as a student, as an undergrad student in the classroom, Every time I talked to my professors and I had my little accommodation letter, my hands were shaking. I was freaking out the entire time. And I had bad experiences to reinforce that, right? I think the statistic right now is like 64% of professors think that students with intellectual disabilities will not succeed in their classroom. So there are like true stigma and barriers to even talking about that conversation. So when you have a professor that immediately is like, let's talk about disability, or makes room for diverse ways of learning, you automatically are like, okay, well, they get it more than most, right? So yeah, that is a really easy way to just build it in. And sometimes I have found that it's actually an easy way in week 3, right? So you can do it at the beginning, but they don't know you. And they may not know what trauma is. They may not know what the difference between being uncomfortable and being triggered is. And so waiting until week 3 to bring it up again can be a good way. They've known you a little bit, you've built a rapport, they may have more language to talk about what it is that they need. And so that can be another way too, not just at the beginning, but re-looking at it in week 3 or 4 is what I would suggest. What else does Carter tell us to do?
She sort of like encourages us to change the question. Instead of like, should we use trigger warnings, it's how should we engage trauma in the classroom?
Yeah.
So, and I really appreciate that, like, just because I think a lot of people hear trigger warnings and assume people are using it as an excuse to get out of an assignment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's usually not the case, but
Super not.
but by changing that question, she's completely like diverting that script.
Yeah, absolutely. Me and my friends joke that Carter had to write an entire article just to be like, this question's dumb, right? Like, which is essentially what they're doing, right? They're having to do all of this legwork, and that people in feminist disability studies and who teach in disability studies, accessible pedagogy have known that you have to do that before you can get to a place where like, can we actually ask like a better relevant question? And so I actually really like that, and the kind of call to action at the end that Carter gives us, right? It invites us into a conversation about how to negotiate trauma. Okay, so how do we implement trigger warnings? You're in a classroom, you're an undergrad, you're teaching. How do you do it? Yeah,
I mean, like,
it's not a trick question.
it feels like a trick question. It's like I see that it's not, but like I utilize them. But I the way I do it is I always set myself, because I have lots of trauma, I can simultaneously set myself in a position. So I am always vulnerable and state my own trauma in a way of, and I talk very honestly about how I've been talking about, for instance, domestic violence for a long time, and how I still get triggered and not understand and not under. And so I think by being vulnerable and allowing for that to be okay. And I think when people see somebody that, even though I don't really have my shit together, it looks like I do maybe when I'm in front of the classroom, possibly, hopefully. And when you can see somebody that looks like they're doing all right, and you might not feel like you're doing all right, I don't know, that's always been encouraging to me. So I definitely utilize them, but I always try to situate myself in the moment as a human being, and not as the professor and you're the student and I know this shit and you don't. And because trauma affects everybody. And so I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I think if you can and you're able and it makes sense pedagogically, I can say that word. It's only going to be in my dissertation like 8 million times. Putting your body on the line like that is awesome, but that is often not something that everyone can do. So I think if you can do it, it makes sense, right? What he said absolutely works. But if you can't, what are some other suggestions?
So like sort of like a Trojan trigger warning, like introduce the readings for the next week. You don't even have to use the word trigger warning. You can just say like, these are some of the topics you're gonna find in it. And then no one can like get upset about or like introduce the snowflake article. Instead, you're just addressing, this is the context.
Yeah, heads up.
This context.
Yeah, definitely gonna write Trojan trigger warning.
Do it.
Love it. Yeah, Shanikia.
So this week's readings follow last week's readings really well. We read Teaching Integrity.
Oh yeah,
And,
I didn't even know that, but like, good job. Yeah.
But that was a conversation we were having, is whether this embodiment can be re-traumatizing. And so I think Carter's point that just starting from the framework that trauma happens in the students and the educators' body and mind, and so acknowledging body, mind, spirit. So it's not like a practice, but just like maybe an attitude that it can be present in everybody's life, and then a trigger warning won't be for a certain group of people. It's like, well, a trigger warning is for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, kind of a holistic way of teaching and embodying that every week can even, I mean, like you feel that in the atmosphere when you walk in and you're like, okay, this is like a class I'm comfortable with. I feel like I can share either bodily or other experiences. And so, yeah, I think that's a great way. What else?
Yeah, just because today it came up. So next week we're doing sexual violence, and one of my students, I was going around, they were doing a project, walking around and talking to them, and next week's come up, and she said, yeah, I make a habit of looking at what's coming up ahead of time before I come into class so that I'm all kind of prepared. So also giving them credit for self-care, even though we need to give them permission to do that, I think they already know how to do that. And we just need to remind them, you know how to take care of you. I don't know how to take care of you.
Yeah.
And I respect that you know how, and I encourage you to do that, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So for people with disabilities, this is a really big one, right? We're often told like, oh, I know what's best for you, or they will suggest things, and it's like, you know who's been dealing with this a lot longer than you? Me, right? And so often they know what they need, right? There's a reason we have syllabi. There's a reason why disability and accessible pedagogy talks about like not changing things last minute. And if you do, making sure that you have it written, you have said it verbally, you send reminders, right? Because like so many people rely on the structure to kind of gauge where they're at. And so, yeah, like just making sure that these resources you have that you don't even think about as like maybe key to someone navigating trauma in the classroom, like the course schedule is actually like really important. Any other suggestions?
I like what she has. Mine doesn't have page numbers, I guess, but midway through talking about the various kinds of acknowledgments where she says you can do a content note or brief description.
Yeah.
I think is good as well. So I'm not sure if she needs like a brief description in the syllabus or like something that would be provided beforehand. And then I know we've kind of talked a lot about this in terms of like the women's study space, but how broadly is it practiced outside of that? You know, like history classes can deal with a lot of things that can, and I haven't ever heard a trigger warning, and some of the material is very intense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only history, so I have one of my degrees is in history, and I think the only time I ever heard it was my history of the Holocaust class, where we were literally watching Shoah Foundation testimonies about their time in the Holocaust. And even that was like, it's hard to get through, and it's like, yeah, no shit, right? And so, yeah, this is like a big staple in gender studies. I think most of us here are aware that this is something we have to be really cognizant of. But how do we reach campus as a whole, right? And I think Carter does a good job of making this, this is important for everyone, because every classroom has these dynamics of trauma. And then I love that you pointed out that Carter says content. I actually don't call them trigger warnings because of it's bullshit. I use content warnings. So a lot of times I'll just be like, hey, heads up on this content coming up, and then I will talk about it. It is such an easy way to mitigate negative reactions where you're still doing what you need to doing and you're still recognizing that trauma happens without bringing in like the loaded issues of trigger. And then another thing that I do that I found is really helpful when talking about content warnings is that I make sure at the very first week I talk about the difference between being uncomfortable and being unsafe, right? So uncomfortable means you feel a little bit guilty, you notice you have some emotions, you maybe feel the need to like defend yourself, right? That can be an uncomfortable part of learning. And so I say that, I give those examples. What does uncomfortable learning look like? And then unsafe, your palms start getting sweaty, your heart rate races, you feel like your chest constricts, you feel like you need out, even if you look perfectly okay, right? And so knowing those differences can really help students understand where they are emotionally, what things might trigger them, and so then they can ask, check the syllabus, see what's coming up, and kind of negotiate that. So I think a lot of people with trauma who enter the classrooms feel unsafe, have anxiety attacks, and they're like, I just have to get through this, right? And so making space to be like, this type of learning, uncomfortable learning is great. Like that is how we grow, is by being uncomfortable, by questioning what we know. If you feel like your body has just run a marathon and all we have done is talked for like 20 minutes, that's very different, right? And so that feeling right there, we can talk about more if you want to. I can give you resources. And so like giving tangible examples at the beginning of the semester sets students up to know, to check in with their own feelings throughout. Anyone else have like great, wonderful things that we can use to employ?
Can you go back on maybe it was the first piece where it talked about depression as well. So, and I know that can present differently, and like the anxiety, or even those who may not even be aware that they have depression, and then some of the, deeper readings can help cause that. So do you include those descriptions as well, or how would you, or what if somebody didn't even realize it, but you notice a change?
Yes. So if it is a one-on-one scenario like that, where like I can very clearly see that a student is coming in consistently late without talking to me, is turning in something late, just looks kind of like, oh shit, in the classroom. I mean, that's not a very descriptive thing to help you, but I think you kind of like get the vibe of it when you enter it. I will send them a quick email just to be like, hey, I loved what you said this other day. I just want to make sure you don't have any questions or need anything from me. And so I always do an email to like lower the risk. And then sometimes I do talk about depression, especially when I do my mental health segment, but I could do a better job about doing it sooner. And I think I'd have to think more about like what that would look like, because depression looks so different for so many people. But I think it could be easily done. I would just have to think through like exactly what pedagogically I would do. Yeah, and if y'all have any ideas, please let me know, because that would be super great. Thank you for that great question. I love it. Okay, anything else about the readings before we move on? Any questions from anything that we have talked about? I'm just like killing it all over the place. Shamithi is like, I'll nod, but also laugh at you a little. A lot. That's just our great relationship. What a rapport we have going. Okay. All right, so let's talk about what the fuck disability justice is and what is CRIP. So one of the things that I have given y'all is this little handy chart. I also put the citation in case you want to look at this book. This book is like 900 fucking pages, but you have access through it online. So it is actually an open access. Yeah, it's 2017, so it's relatively new. And so if you want to look it up, you can. But I just went ahead and pulled out the disability justice chart because I thought it would be kind of a helpful starting place to talk about it. So I am going to read a little bit of it just so we kind of all get it together. So bear with me. So disability justice advocates define disability as a political experience of oppression, understandable only in interaction with experiences of other social identities. So SES, race, gender, and sexual orientation, right? So disability justice is very much like embedded within an intersectional approach. So the main ideas, so disability justice advocates argue that disability is a political experience of oppression that can be understood only in the context of multi-issue commitment to social justice. They argue that access is a baseline, so like ADA, it's the floor. But the goal is transforming society to function for all people and value interdependence. So one of the most influential disability justice advocates is Mia Mingus. And what Mia Mingus says is that, in kind of a similar move to the Combahee River Collective, where they're saying, if you free Black lesbian women, right, everyone will be free. That is kind of the position some disability justice advocates have taken. So Mia Mingus has talked about how disabled people are literally in every oppressed group, right? It's one of the only groups where that is true, especially when you consider temporary disability, when you consider aging, right? Everyone at some point will be in this minority. and or and they are all in other kind of social justice. So for disability justice advocates, centering disability justice is a way to transform society, right? So that is very much their way into justice, is through a disability lens. Yeah, and so again, one of the main ideas is that they really value interdependence, right? So coalition building, community asking for help is a great way. So I talk about my students when we talk about disability justice, that like being like, hey, can you help me, is like a radical disability justice move. And so practitioners talk about disability must be addressed alongside other forms of oppression on campus, including racism, sexism, and other efforts to create more inclusive campuses. All members of the campus should recognize, value, and support interdependent rather than independent relationships. Accessibility should be considered a minimal standard, and what is being made accessible must function for all community members. So again, this centering of interdependence and also very much following the history of the queer movement and feminist movement, right? Disability justice was built by disabled women of color. And so they very much like Crenshaw did for talking about intersectionality was like, all right, white people, like disabled experiences differ, right? You have to look at this intersectionally. And so I think it's really important that we kind of understand that the disability justice framework is absolutely embedded with disabled women of color, right? And so they have provided this amazing framework to which we can kind of view disability justice. Questions on that?
Would you say this is the text, like if someone wanted to familiarize themselves with this topic, this text, or would it be?
On disability justice?
Yeah.
I think the best way to do disability justice would be to do Mia Mingus's blog, which I put in the resources section. You can find it. It's like a fun hunt and find. So she has a blog called Leaving Evidence, and if you just Google Leaving Evidence Mia Mingus, it'll pop right up. I also put the URL. She does a lot of great work. So she defines things about like being monstrous, what access intimacy looks like. And so she goes through disability justice. She also posts talks that she gives. So she was a keynote speaker at NWSA in 2015, I think. And she also won an award for creating change because she's a transracial, queer, disabled woman of color. So she works a lot with queer communities as well. So I would say that would be a little bit better. And then if you want more of like scholars taking up disability justice, this might be a good secondary. But in terms of like what is disability justice in academia, I think that has been like incredibly under theorized. This is a relatively new recognition. Like the fact that this was like in the book at all was like, oh my God. Does that help, Shamia?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cool. Other questions about this? Awesome. And then I just put a little blurb about CREP on the sheet I gave you. So CREP is different than disability justice. It's somewhere, I'm sorry. My pages look different than yours, so I can't direct you as well as I would like. It's on the back of the group one. Thank you. So I like to think about disability justice as an umbrella, and CRIP studies and CRIP theory kind of falling under it. That is not how everyone views CRIP theory and CRIP studies. And so I just want to make sure you know that that is not the only way people view it. But CRIP is the specific intersections of queerness and disability. So like queer theory, CRIP theory is to, and I'm just going to read Carrie Sandall's quote, to spin mainstream representations or practices to reveal able-bodied assumptions and exclusionary effects, to expose the arbitrary delineation between normal and defective, and the negative social ramifications of attempts to homogenize humanity. So CRIP as a verb can therefore be understood as a form of disidentification. So much the same way that queer is now an active politicized term that people identify for and used to like resist mainstream's understanding of sexuality. CRIP, which is short for cripple, has been reclaimed for those in the intersections of disability and queerness. So if we're thinking about the classroom, I would say that like a disability justice classroom, and this opinion is allowed to change, is more like centering transformation of society as a whole, right? So that would be the lens, your learning goals would match up with that. Whereas if you were wanting to do a CRIP pedagogy and center CRIP studies, your kind of whole goal, all of your learning goals that would go to it would be to call out normative practices and call out these kind of fake dichotomies that we find ourselves in embodied practices in disability. So it's a little bit more radical. I think justice is radical, but it's a little more in your face, right? So people who say, the great example I always use that's in Alison Kiefer's book, Feminist Queer CRIP, she has this great example of what does being an advocate or an activist, a CRIP activist look like? And her example would be Connie Panzanero sign that she takes to Pride that says, "Trach dykes eat pussy without coming up for air," right? So, so trach means that, right, you have a breathing machine through your throat, right? So you can eat pussy without having to stop and breathe. And so it very much is in your face. It's pointing out the way disability and sexuality kind of mix. It's also calling attention to like in-group versus out-group, right? You have to know what trach is to get into that. You have to know what a dyke is, right? And so it's pulling all of these things together. And so a disability justice might not take that same approach. Does that make sense? Okay. I love both equally, and I think they each have their strengths and weaknesses. So it's really just kind of a matter of what you want to do. I think for the purposes today, I'm leaning a little more towards disability justice, but if you want more information about CRIP, let me know. There's a whole bunch of white men in the field who talk about it, and I'm against that. So I can, in general. So I can point you to scholars who are talking about CRIP in really intersectional ways and really embedded in the community.
So how does the gang culture feel about?
That's what I went to. Me too. That's what I kept going to. I had to not get the connection until you said crippled. Yeah.
So shockingly, I don't know a lot about the gay related.
Because the Crips have been around a long time.
Yeah,
they might have.
I mean, like,
their neighbors.
I feel like you would have aspects of disability.
Or if you have somebody who's blood or something
There's
else.
a piece on it. There's actually a piece on it. I don't remember who wrote it. I don't remember the title.
I'll look it
But
up.
there's a point in there where like he argues that they're inherently related because CRIP is talking about like disability, and a lot of gang members find themselves disabled because of gun violence, find themselves disabled because of different access to medical care, find themselves disabled because of what goes on in prisons, both like the violence in there between inmates, but also with guards. So
the systemic thing.
So that's an interesting one. I honestly don't know who wrote it though.
Well,
I don't know.
I do know what you're talking about now. I'll have to look it up. I don't know. I have like a very list of like, oh, get away, Robert McClure. We don't need you anymore. So that's a big podcast. I met Robert McClure. He was very nice. It's fine. But also, I think there is a tie. I don't know much about it. Lieber Moore, who is one of the founders of Black Disability Studies Coalition and Pedagogy, which I also give you that information where to find more. They actually give you an entire syllabus if you want to teach a Black Disability Studies course. Has an entire group called Crip Hop Nation, right? And it's spelled with a K, not a C. And so there are connections to it. That is just not my area of expertise. I know, you look at me and you're like, she knows all about gays. Yeah, it shouldn't be like, sounds legit. Okay. Any questions about CRIP or disability studies? All right, I'm gonna shut up now. We're gonna do a small group activity. And by shut up, I mean, I'm still gonna talk, but in little circles rather than a big one. Okay, So essentially, we're going to divide up into groups. I think 4 people per group is plenty. And there's going to be a team captain in the group, and I'm just going to randomly assign someone. And the only thing the team captain is doing is they are going to pick one aspect of teaching. And this can be course development, like actual pedagogy, PowerPoints, group work, assignments, office hours, emails. You can also pick any teaching aspect of online courses. Just pick one. And I want you to think through that aspect of teaching with disability at the center. And so I give you discussion questions to go through to help you do that. But use the brochure, use kind of the handouts I've given you, but I want you to basically rework that entire aspect thinking about disability. And I'm gonna come around if you have questions and help, and also just like awkwardly hang out with y'all and listen to all the good things you say. But yeah, so you can answer the questions together. This is, again, one of those skills. So I think in some ways when you're embedded in disability pedagogy, this becomes second nature, but it was absolutely a skill that like took time to develop, to think about all of the different ways in which you have to adapt your teaching to be as accessible as possible. Questions on this? Okay, so if we want to do like Morgan, Shelley, Darlene, Bo. Audrey, do you want to be in a group? Sure. Okay, you don't have to. Audrey, Nadia, Aubrey, Shamithia, Veronica, and then we'll have, maybe we'll do a group of 3 and then 3. Okay. Yeah, okay. So we'll do Dyson and then Christine, B, and Carla. Yeah, and like if you need to take a break,